Thank you very much. I guess this is working okay. I want you to know that it's a great pleasure to wear a tie. And a great honor. Also, very sincerely, I'm very honored that all of you would come to this and spend some time to hear some of these things that I kind of wanted to say and to share. As I thought about what I would talk about and how I would talk about it, I ran into this quotation from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Gabriel Garcia Marquez is a Colombian novelist who is associated with the school of magical realism. And I took, this quotation spoke to me, and what's more, I thought that it gave me an excuse to adopt this as an approach to this talk, meaning that I frankly did not spend a lot of time in talking about these historical things, looking back at figures and dates. These things are, to the best of my recollection, and might, in some cases, not be factually exactly accurate. But in the spirit of magical realism, I hope that they are in fact more true than what mere facts would portray.
You with the tie. Who are you really?
Also, I need to say that as I talk, I will at times hit certain highlights, mention certain people. Only actually a very small subset of people that I've worked with here. Many people who have been important to me and important to the institution will not be mentioned. And I just wanted to acknowledge that fact straight off. I'd like to acknowledge and admit that, amazingly, I think, for someone in my position, this is my first and only PowerPoint. This is my, if you will, my capstone PowerPoint. And even at that, especially to get this very nice opening slide, I had to have Sarah Dawn's help. I acknowledge her assistance. I ran across something else as I was thinking about this talk. It was something written by a friend of mine who I did a Google search, and this is what I came up with. My friend is a cartographer artist. He grew up in Minneapolis. He was very familiar, spent a lot of time in the Boundary Waters canoe area up there, was very interested in nature and the natural world and in the sensibility of the natural world. He took as his profession for a while cartography, map making. Taught for a while in the geography department at the University of Montana up in Missoula. And I found this. When I led young men on canoe trips in the Border Lakes canoe country, as when I taught cartography and observations to university students, I discovered that the map, in telling us where to go, kept us from discovering where to go. In making our own maps, we discovered the place, and in this place, we discovered the journey. When I started here at Weber State in 1988, December of 1988, I had no map. I think in terms of forecasting the evolution of information technology at that time, I don't think that even the wisest people could foresee the great changes that have happened to universities, to society, and to our industry. So it was then, therefore, my pleasure to discover my own path. And I have taken it as my task here to try to describe that journey to you. And I guess in hopes maybe that we can all start to then understand the place where we are better. I came to work in December 1988 for the Department of Academic Computing. This was a department of 3 people, myself included, Eric Jacobson, and Jim Miner. We were 3 of us working at that time, not in the department, but closely working with us was at that time associated with an organization I believe called the Writing Lab, was Debbie Russell. We were in some part, at least seen as part of a larger computing services organization, all housed up where my office still is, up in that part of the Tech Ed building. Computing services also included 10 programmers, including Mark Green, Betty Zaleski, Ron Jensen, Debbie Brennan, and I don't believe anybody else is still at the university. There were also 2 system administrators, one for the VAC system, one for the library systems, which were then housed up there. Roy Stock, the director of computing services, and Brooke Chase, who took care of the multiplexers, the muxes, and the terminals that people would connect to the VAC system with, and a fellow that I never met except at Christmas parties because he worked at night, named Robert Herman. Craig Hall, the director of the library, was also the director of the Computing Services Organization. In a technical description, there are a number of PCs scattered around campus. Quite a few AT&T 6300s. If you remember those little boxes. A privileged few had IBM AT computers with 286 processors. Very advanced processors at the time. In general, what was thought of as computing was centered on the VACs, the mainframes. There are actually 2 large VAC systems at that point. The network, to the extent that anybody thought about a network, was a system of serial lines that connected people's terminals to the VACs. And there they did their work, whether it was administrative, accounting, or much, I think probably most student work was done in that environment also. Student computing work, compilers, and principally. I found that my job had a certain flow to it, that I had to spend a certain amount of time, or had the opportunity to spend a certain amount of time servicing users' requests. I found a lot of those requests had to do with the fact that up in the nursing department, there were a number of office workers up there, secretaries for their different programs, who needed to share files, needed principally WordPerfect documents that they needed to share. They shared those on floppy disks. Back in the day, floppy disks really were floppy. They were prone to corruption, and I found that learning some basic tricks with Norton utilities and familiarity with fact tables, I could oftentimes uncorrupt, fix their files, give them back their documents. And they were wonderful bakers, and always had a plate of fudge for me with the size of the plate dependent roughly upon the size of the document. So I found that was a good thing to do. I also was sometimes called over to the children's school, and there I found it advantageous to go over and time my visits to be right after nap time when the chocolate chip cookies came out of the oven. There were some difficult times. There was I had to go up and do some work in what's called the bed lab up in the again part of the nursing department in health professions. Again, it's a lab for students to do student exercises. They're nursing students. It's set up like a hospital ward, with beds and these dummies for patients. And they decided that they should put computers beside the beds because hospitals were getting computerized then for the care patient management systems were getting computerized, so they should have computers there. And so I forgot what I had to go up there, but I had to go around, teach computer, and do something. And I went up on a certain day and doing this. The lab was run by an older woman named Effie. Effie was very proprietary about her lab, very territorial. I'm sure she did a very, very good job running that lab, but she wanted it run just so. And I'm not sure she really liked having the computers there because they were kind of new, and she didn't like me having me being there because she didn't know me, and I was fiddling with the computers, and so I was working, and she mentioned that a class was due to start in 10 minutes, and I told her, well, okay, I'll try to get done. And kept working. She became a little bit more nervous. I said, well, class is starting in 5 minutes. I said, well, okay, I'm doing as best as I can here. Because I wanted to, get done with what I was doing and be done with it, not have to go back. And students came in. They were all young ladies, nursing students, and started settling in. And Effie came and says, class is going to start in 1 minute. I said, well, Effie, I'll be very quiet here. I won't disturb anything. It's going to take me a few minutes more to finish this, but I really want to finish it. She wasn't happy with this, but she left. And, it got to the top of the hour, and she kind of glared at me one last time, and then she turned herself to address the class and said something like, class, we will proceed today as we usually do. We'll first have the movie illustrating our exercise, and then we will proceed to the lab exercise. The topic for today is catheterization of the male. That's working on the computer. I'm out of here. So that was a near miss. if you will, the political and cultural, the institutional view of computing, of information technology, to the extent that the institution had any vision of information technology, was stars, stars, stars. Okay? The star system, I believe, had been rolled out just a year or so previously. As is typical with systems, there is quite a gap between expectations and reality. The institution was working those things through, working other issues connected with stars. That's what the talk was all around campus. Meanwhile, in my world, I was going around, I was seeing these desktops. They were very powerful. They really empowered the users to expand their jobs, to expand their capabilities. Potential for learning and teaching were very great. And I thought the institution was really misguided not to be looking at that, not to be conscious of that. And so for that reason, I felt sort of in doing what I could to improve and advance the notion of these desktop, power at the desktop, I felt as if I was being somehow subterranean, subversive, revolutionary. As a child of the 60s and 70s, this was very important to me. Any opportunity that I could get. I felt like the entire focus on these applications, on stars, administrative applications, I guess in the current terminology, it sucked all the oxygen out of the atmosphere. There was no energy, no room for the campus to really think about anything else in terms of computing. That was the general case. There were some things that were happening. There were a number of local area networks on campus, and I was enough tied into that to see the power that local area networking would provide in combination with these powerful desktops. There was interestingly enough, one of the department leaders in technology was the HR department. At that time, still Stan was the leader. They had their own network, an ArcNet network that they had installed there. To my knowledge, they were the only business type of office on campus that had a network at that time. There were a number of student computer labs that were networked. In general, the computer labs had this little funny little 1 megabit network called Corvus OmniNet, and the lab that was around the corner here in the business building had a Token Ring network. These labs, I believe, had been largely the impetus and startup funding, I believe, and the technology there had been funded, I believe, pretty much the ARCC, Academic Resources Computing Committee, had a large part in providing that startup money and had the vision that there is more to computing than the VACs and stars. Furthermore, around the time that I started, the ARCC funded fiber optic connections between buildings, actually laying the fiber optics, connecting the buildings so that there would be good data communication between the buildings, something beyond the simple serial lines that ran to our VAX terminals. And then the ARCC and the chair of the ARCC at that time was Dale Ostley. And I believe that Dale was, as the ARCC was kind of a leader in seeing the vision. I think that Dale was one of those who helped the ARCC to to come to that vision, Dale and Eric working together. And they then started funding projects to not only to run fiber optics to the buildings, but also to extend the networks into offices, to connect faculty offices. And it fell to me then to manage these projects, to put some reality to this notion of these networked offices. And this was, in a way, this was exciting, because this was my revolutionary sword. If I can exaggerate a little bit, it was sad because it was the end of the fudge and cookies era. Fortunately, around that time, the kind of technology for network connections kind of coalesced. The ArtNet, the Token Ring, Corvus OmniNet kind of went by the wayside, and we could see clearly that what we needed to do was to install, run an Ethernet network, and that Twisted Pair would be a very good technology for running into offices. Our ES&R group, because that was essentially telephone wiring, they already kind of knew the techniques. They could extend, learn what they needed, and install that. Around that time, Novell NetWare 3.1 evolved, a very solid, very easy to use, easy to manage file service, print service platform. That was available for us to use. And so we started building the network. As initially rolled out, the campus was one 10 megabit Ethernet collision domain, if I can be a little bit. Okay? That is, it was all one. Okay? Anything that you sent on the network went everywhere. That's how Ethernet networks work, and that's how that one worked. And that became limiting a little bit, and we learned to use bridges, which were these big honking boxes. And we had one connection on each side, and we give, on each side, each of the connections was a single 10 megabit port, and we could, divide the traffic then, and, the thing stayed on this side unless they really needed to cross, and so forth. And I figured out a way with a standard, or by using a kind of a non-standard, slightly out of protocol use of dual port AUI connectors. I figured out a way to basically break buildings up into their own collision domain, but still have the servers up in my area, up in the data center, but still part of that building's collision domain. And then we had we had a backbone. We called it a backbone. It was technically is a 10-base-2 Ethernet, known affectionately in the industry as frozen yellow garden hose. It actually ran around on our 3 or 4 loops in the computer room wall, and then ran over to the ET building. And we'd plug everything into it with what was called vampire taps, which were these taps that we screw in and drill a hole into this big thick wire. A very important event that happened, or series of events that happened, that was kind of unnoticed by me for a while, was that I'm not clear what the circumstances were here, but somehow it came to pass that the university applied for an NFS grant, a National Science Foundation grant, for the purpose of hooking the university up to something called the Internet. This was done with a lot of assistance and working with the University of Utah, which was the point where we would connect. And my colleague Jim Miner was listed as the principal investigator, put that grant together and kind of managed it. And I was working on other things, but I saw that a certain group of people were talking about different kinds of things, something called Cisco equipment, and then they were talking about something about a T1 that would connect us down to the University of Utah, and then they loaded up something called Multinet, some software that magically somehow connected our VACs to the world. This was amazing. The first thing that I learned was that you could email people far away. VACs had this kind of mail utility on it, and it was commonly used by some of us. You type in somebody's name or username and send it to them. But if you did these funny things with quotation marks and percent signs, and you put this funny little @ sign on in a certain way, and frequently you'd have to say something @ something @ bitnet, and it'd go far away, and as likely as not, whoever would send something back to you. And this was amazing. And I found that there were something called list servers out there that you could in some way sign up for, and you'd get on these lists of all these people sharing information. And I found that there were 2 or 3 or 4 lists of people just like me at universities, because at that time this internet thing was very much centered around universities. And there were people just like me at universities who were trying to figure out what to do with all this stuff. And it became very very useful. I could read about people who were experiencing the same questions, the same problems I was, and they had their solutions right there. And what's more, they would produce software, they would produce files. And there was something called FTP on the VACs. And if I did the right thing and managed it right, I could go to Minneapolis or Chicago or London and get their files and bring them, And then I'd download them to my PC through a serial permit download or something like that, and I could start building things that would run on the PC, because there's a great wealth of software like this, free software, shareware, and public domain software that was out there on this internet, and lots of people who would help you use it. And as I paid attention and worked this more and more, I even found, well, guys, there's some real rookies here. They're asking the same questions I did a couple months ago, so I'd help them, and it was very exciting. And there are all kinds of little flavors. There was things you could do on the VACs, and it was all text-based. Okay. There was FTP. There was this program called Archie. Okay, that you'd hear about some file that you wanted. You'd type Archie in the file name, and it would somehow go out on the internet and find 5 or 6 places where that file lived, and then you could get it. And there was something called Veronica. I forgot what Veronica does. Yeah. There was something called Gopher, which would allow you to peek up and look at material that other people would put on their Gopher servers. And now as a means for sharing, as it started to expand, all kinds all kinds of information. As I studied this, I saw that a lot of this talk was about something called TCP/IP, which was something called a protocol, which was the way systems talk to each other. Because I had kind of thought that, our vision had been that, systems just somehow talked. It was like native, inborn in them. God had decreed that VAXes would talk DECnet. Okay? Our Novell systems would talk IPX, SPX, and that's just the way it was. But there was this TCP/IP that was something that you just kind of built that you actually managed for your own purposes. The system didn't manage you like Novell did or like DECnet did. And there's a lot of possibilities there. As I thought about that, and as I thought more and more, or studied more and more, I discovered you could run this TCP/IP. You could run it right on your own PC. An amazing thing. My PC hooked up to this network, but it connected me to my Novell servers. But wow, and so. Okay, so I figured out how to set up TCP/IP and typed in, FTP, cc.universityofutah.edu. I was connected from my desktop, from my PC. I was going out in the world. An amazing thing. Just an amazing thing. And I got this program called Etherreel. This is sniffing software. Put that on the wire. Sniffing was a whole lot easier back in those days. Because what I said about that. These big collision domains. You can see all the traffic everywhere. So if you're interested in something, it's right there. You can see it. And so I followed the packet, and sure enough, my PC out to our Cisco router and it vanished. And then come back, from this foreign IP address and come back to my PC. An amazing thing. And this stream of it. Okay. So what are we going to do with this? Well, I had a problem. I was building this network of PCs based upon the LAN connections. And I believe really it was powerful. It was something. It was going to be a way of the future. But the culture, the business here was VAX, and that would be the first, aggravate me to no end, but it'd be the first and very legitimate question that somebody would ask. We'd set them up on the network. They'd say, well, okay, how do I connect start? Well, you don't. You connect here, you get your files, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, okay. You can share the printer down the hall. That's cool, yeah. Okay, you got stars? Okay. Well, you see, this TCP/IP was a more general protocol. It was a more general language for systems talking to each other. Okay, and I figured out that if I could run the TCP/IP on the PC, then I could talk to the VAX. But the PC was set up to talk to the network servers, And Novell kind of owned the networking hardware. What am I going to do about that? Well, I researched the internet. This is a common problem. And I found the solution, okay? That the solution was that people had developed ways of abstracting the services in the inside the system, if I can get a little bit technical. That the protocol didn't have to own the card. Okay? That you could run just a driver that would run the hardware, and then you could load a variety of protocols and get them all to connect to this hardware driver, and your PC could be multi-protocol. Okay? One vendor, one system didn't have to own your PC. You could you could do whatever. An amazing thing again, in that context. And this is, it's so fundamental that it's very much a commonplace at this time. But then it was a very, in the technical sense, very, very fundamental change. I found out, interestingly enough, the technology, a lot of the technology and the files and the instructions I got to do this were very much Utah-based. I used software, this driver for the cards. Most of it came from Clarkson University in New York. But the connector, how do I get that to talk to a Novell system? Well, the connector for that was written from BYU, and they made it available to them. There's an engineering professor at Utah State University under whose auspices a suite of programs or an application called Kermit was developed, which he had elaborated into a terminal emulation or telnet program, which then very feature-rich, very easy to manage, but feature-rich application that I could then actually load it and I could answer people's question. Okay, you just load Joe's software, you set it up to talk to the packet driver, and you're talking to the backs. There it is. Username, password, you're in. Okay. So it's hard to convey the kind of how exciting that was at that time to reach out in this invisible community of like-minded people in similar jobs to mine, pull these bits and pieces together and build something that was new and fundamentally different. At least that was my view of things. Okay. So I say, in many ways, the university was still vax, stars, vax. To talk about, it was felt that, I should talk some about at the higher levels, as it were, what I was doing. The higher levels at this point meant a group called, I believe it was the Computer Management Committee, that was charged with, overseeing information technology. It wasn't called information technology, it's called computing. That committee was, as I recollect, composed of 3 people from the computing arena. Craig Hall, the director, Eric Jacobson, the academic director, and Roy Stock, the computing center director. 2 vice presidents, student affairs vice president, and at that time he was called the vice president of academic affairs, I believe. Later the title there was changed to provost. I went down, was on the agenda to talk to them about what was happening here, how the campus was getting connected. Well, as is typical, there was a hot issue connected to stars, and I sat at the end of the table and stars, and great emotion and a lot of discussion, and at the end there wasn't really time for me to talk too much about this. And Bob Smith, who was the vice president of academic affairs, did look down at the agenda and say, well, now, what's this Ethernet? Well, I thought I had to do something. I felt good about the technical base then of where I was at, but I thought I had to do something visible to, create something on the campus. And there are 2 things that I did. One is that I had decided I needed to reconceptualize the network. Okay. or maybe just conceptualize the network, because I don't know if I'd ever conceptualized it in the first place. But I had to think of the network not as connections, not as machines talking to each other, but I needed to think about it as a collection of services presented to users to help them do their jobs. Okay? And it was both, the network was both the collection and the presentation. So I looked around, I found a commercial product in this case, Sabre Menu, created a very nice, very nice, easy to use menu interface for this suite of services. Users could bring this up, punch a couple buttons, get into, do most of the things that any office worker would reasonably need to do. And very important from my perspective, it was while it was very flexible, it was also very easily managed. It was very role-based. I could turn things on and off for groups of people very easily, depending upon how they were classified. And so the network changed according to who you were. Very important. It was important to me, this was just me and a student assistant. I had a young man named Mike Larson working with me for a while, and then Mike left for full-time appointment. Chuck Wright came to work with me at that time, and he was a student assistant. We developed a very cookie-cutter kind of installation. Go out, set up machines on the network. Like I say, they could do, they were empowered. They could do many things that they couldn't do before. And it was very efficient because, it was literally, at that time, it was me and Chuck. Chuck was half-time, and we took care of every academic department, every college, and a good deal of spillover, other people would call. Okay. So the way I had to work was I had to know more, Chuck and I had to know more about the people's machines than they did. I never asked people how they were configured. I knew how they were configured. The missing piece in this, the killer application, if you will, was email. Okay. The university had an email system. It was on the VAX. I've alluded to it. But to use the system, you had to log on to the VAX. It was a separate login. You could connect to it efficiently, but it was there. But there's still another step, another login. It was text-based, not really intuitive. I don't even know if it was I. One of us looked out on the network, found that in this community there existed something called Pegasus Mail, P-mail. For some reason, this fella in New Zealand, I believe, I've forgotten his name.
Yeah, I've forgotten too, but it was.
Do you remember his name?
Last name Thompson. I can't remember the first name.
He wrote this email system, and it just ran, plug and play, if you will, on a NetWare server. No separate user administration. The mailboxes were already set up. All you had to do is load it. You get this software off the network. It was public domain. I don't know how the guy made money. I don't know if he worked for a university or he had some things. He would sell the documentation. He didn't have to have the documentation. It was pretty simple, but he would sell it out. So, we sprung for $50, $100 for the documentation and felt we ought to do that. Got the software, loaded it up. When I say me, I mean my helper, a student helper named Abraham Kaloli, who was working with us then. Can you kind of wave, Abraham?
Sure.
Abraham is now with the Utah Transit Authority. He does not drive a bus.
We're trained to do that. Union.
With this free software, with a lot of help from Abraham, we could set up the email on our servers. There are some ways we could use some borrowed, scavenged software or hardware. We could load these simple programs on that would interconnect the different servers. We even found this, somebody had published this program that we could load, and it would actually move mail from our Pegasus system out to this internet and back. Around this time, we were approached by Professor Jim Young from the English department, who was a leader of a group. I believe they'd gotten a Hemingway grant and needed to collaborate and wanted to have some easy way to collaborate. And they didn't want to use the VAX. I don't know why. And so we kind of showed them this. They said, well, yeah, okay, this looks pretty cool. We can do this. We can use this. And so we kind of got permission to set this up for them, and then we kind of forgot to limit it to them. And everybody had email right on their desktop. Easy to use, right in front of them, intuitive, and it was fun, it was exciting, and I think that's what really, that's when email really caught fire. I think it was something that people could use that would, if you, something that was really vivid and became part of people's lives, their computer. There were some rough edges there in the implementation. Looking back, I can see some problems. For instance, there's a certain lack of communication, I think, which I'll take a substantial part of the blame with my peers. Again, we had our ideologies. I was kind of offended at the whole idea of terminal emulation. I grudgingly accepted that we had to take these hotshot PCs and turn them on into dumb terminals. I hated it, And so, we did it, and I set it up. The administrative computing people, I don't think they really understood what I was doing and how I was doing it. All they knew is that their users now are somehow connecting over my system. But they were real good with COBOL. They were real good with S1032, the database language that STARS was written in. This was neither one of those things, and so they kind of were at an arm's length for me. And so there were some things that kind of fell through the cracks. One of the issues that you have in terminal emulation is key mapping, because a PC keyboard does not look like the old serial terminal keyboards. And this Kermit program that I used had this very wonderful, flexible way of controlling that you could map with a simple text file that you would load, which then I could set it up on the network so everybody had the same text file. You could connect the keys, say PC key is this key and that, okay? And so okay, that's cool. Well, what am I going to do? Well, I looked at the VAX terminal. I've forgotten what they were called, BT100s or something. The key in the upper left-hand corner said hold screen. Okay? If you push it, it delivers Control S, pause, Control. Anyhow, it just pauses the serial flow, or toggles it on and off. So that's what I mapped the F1 key to. Okay. Some years later, it was years later, I was talking to Ron Smith, about this era, and he said this, that system just didn't work at all with FRS. It didn't work with our accounting system. Where's the meetings? It didn't. Well, it's just on the terminal. What was the problem with it? He said, well, it'd lock up. People would do work. They'd be working on it, and then and I'd be helping them through how to do some function, and I'd say, and now hit the PF1 key, which was an important key in functionality there, and their screen would lock up. And I thought, ouch. Really? Huh. Okay. The other thing I thought I needed to do, I created this thing. I think for it to really be a campus, to be something that people would talk about, it had to have a name. And so this collection of services, so I came up with a name for this collection of services. I called it Weberlinks. And so, and so there was, for a time, Weberlinks as a set of services and an interface that was fairly common across campus and got, got the powerful desktop PC started. Debbie Russell, who by this time had come up to work with us in academic computing, created a lab version of the same thing called LabLinks. While all this was going on, the university was in a state of flux. There was, I was working at this level, but, there were major technological tides flowing. Things were happening in academia and in the industry. And I think that there was a feeling here on campus that in computing terms, the university was stagnant. It was, if it was moving at all, it was just drifting. The reason for that perception is because the university was stagnant and drifting. And so the university did the natural things that a university does when dealing with a problem of that nature, that magnitude. Held campus-wide meetings and hired a consultant. And there were a number of meetings held. My recollection is these meetings were facilitated by Carol Hansen, still a professor in the library, by Dolly Sampson, who was a very energetic, professor of information service systems and technology. Could have been the chair even at that time of that department, and Ann Milner, who at that time was associated with the continuing education department. And as these things evolved, I of course got swept up in minor and major ways. The minor way was that this was maybe in 1994 or so. The consultant came and, as consultants do, coalesce the feelings on campus into 4 or 5 steps that the university really ought to take to get us off the dime. And at this time, the university was still on a semester system. There was and so classes didn't start until the last week in September. I think, people who worked on campus by mid-September were pretty much desperate for something to do. And so the university held week-long opening of school meetings. Okay? And there were all these kinds of meetings about, different developments and things. Dolly and Eric decided to hold a meeting to talk about the consultant's report and where the university was going in terms of information technology. And they scheduled that, and I think it was in this building. Yeah, it was in this building downstairs. So far, so good. They realized that's maybe not the most exciting subject in the world, so they decided they'd jazz it up and add some elements of it, of a skit. And they selected their parts. And then they came to me and asked me to be the consultant, present the report. And so this is what you got to say. These are the points you got to make. But jazz it up, make it fun. And so I went home and thought about, okay, an IT consultant's report. How are we going to make this fun? How are we going to do this? Well, I don't know, And as luck would have it, over that weekend, we happened to go to a movie. And we went to see, it's Mel Brooks' movie, I think, Men in Tights. Okay? And if you remember the strategic interludes in that movie, this group of merry men get out and do this kind of rap thing, And I thought, that works. That works. I can do this. So I wrote up, practicing lyrics, wrote up some things, worked it out, came back to campus, called up Catherine Zublin, got from the drama department, got a costume that I thought was a wizard with a robe and a funny hat. Went and talked to John Dazelle in theater, the props guy, got this staff that was actually a shepherd's crook, but figured it'd be good for a wizard. And sat in the presentation. When Eric cued me for, what did the consultant say, I got up and it was a lot of fun. This had two effects. One is I've never since been asked to give a presentation to a general campus meeting. And within 2 years, the university had abolished the whole notion of the week-long opening of school. Major things. The consultant, part of the recommendations, part of what the university decided to do was to create a division of information technology. Would provide a focus for information technology, would define, in fact, what we were doing as information technology, as some kind of mission-critical thing. And this division was to be headed up by the chief information officer, vice presidential level officer. And then that fall, Don was hired by the university, and the division of information technology was created. It was decided very rightly that it was appropriate within this division that there be some group that give explicit attention to infrastructure. That these things don't just happen, but if there's going to be a network, there need to be people in charge of the network. Don came to me and asked me to head up this group, and I did. That initial group was Chuck Wright, Brooke Chase, Bill Clark, and soon Marianne Bolander joined us. And I guess in not too long, Debbie Brennan became an associate, dotted line member, too. Ever after that, I will go ahead and talk about some of the things that I did. But ever after that point, you have to realize that the things I talk about are not necessarily things that I did, but things that were done that others did that was kind of within my purview, but that others should get the credit for doing the actual work. In this era, also, however, PCs at this time became very powerful. Very powerful, very flexible. They became, they doubled and doubled and doubled in terms of speed and RAM. They became feasible to run a graphical operating system on their Windows, and then Windows 95 came out. And the computer, the interface became colorful, it became engaging, it became sexy. But at the same time, it lacked. There was in this new environment, there were no tools for central administration. And between the lack of tools and somehow this power really empowered the users, many of them, a minority, but a considerable minority, to a new feeling for their computer. That the computer became, a personal computer became very personal. It was very personalized. It was an extension of the person. Okay? I had always thought of the computer as an extension of my system. It pushed my system out to them. And it was no longer so. It was a part of the person, and they were no more willing to cede control to me than they would, cede any other aspect of their personality. And as I say, I was faced with this utter lack of any mechanisms for this kind of control. Anyway. And so we had these PCs and this new environment that was very powerful, very engaging, but it was not supportable in the same terms that Chuck and I had done. There was no elegance in this. There was no cookie cutter approach that was possible. I guess another way to look at this is, it was. I have written down here, it was Christians versus the Lions, Part 2, or How I Lost the Battle of the Desktop to Bill Gates. So the university, the division was faced with exponential growth in support needs and user support needs. And the university quickly adapted that by creating a computing support department headed up at that time by Betty Tucker. And our first group of technicians, 4 student technicians who did the bulk of the hands-on work, 4 young, very bright students, young lady named Lisa Reams, a guy named Nick. I've forgotten his last name. Well, his last name was Nicholas. I've forgotten his first name. Roy Ansmania, and a young man that I still see around, and what's his name? Mark? Matt. Yeah, he works for Prime Computing Systems. Still see him on campus quite a bit. Those were our first 4 techs, and those were the pioneers in helping us actually support the users. In terms of my own role, I looked at that whole thing and I bailed out. I tried to get myself as far away from desktop support as I could. Which was good because there was a lot of work that needed to be done with the infrastructure. That was my area, infrastructure. The first summer, this is in one summer, we did 2 very fundamental things, I think. One is that we, again, this was the group, and substantially, frankly, it was under the leadership and work of Bill Clark. we installed GroupWise as an actual enterprise email system. As I said, I was very proud of our Pegasus email system, but there's only so far that you can go with shareware and hardware that you picked up at Deseret Industries. It really wasn't an enterprise system. GroupWise was, as I decided at the time, they don't list it as a prerequisite. You love picking up GroupWise, you need this, you need this, you need this. The institution needed a CIO, needed a division before we could have GroupWise. Okay? Because somebody had to secure the resources, consolidate the resources, and get buy-off from the campus. So once we had that, then we could have an enterprise email system. The other thing that we did that summer was more subtle, less obvious, but I think was more important. And it's one of those things that people now think, this was just how God created the universe. We subnetted the campus. Okay. Our campus up to that time had been composed of, one flat network. We had 4 digits for the addresses, but it was all one network. And we implemented an architecture of changing that so that we had the logical foundation to actually build an enterprise network. There were some bad days during this time. One of the instances, we went through an episode where our network would just die. People would lose connections everywhere. And we'd go and we had this single switch that controlled the whole campus. And we'd go back, and activity lights behind this they'd just be bright, solid. You could read a newspaper by these activity lights. These blink. They're supposed to blink, mostly off. So these times, so we have to turn off that switch, kill everything, start it up, and then we'd be okay for a while. This went on for a week or a couple weeks, and one day things lined up so that we could actually capture some packets, which is kind of like putting a stethoscope or an X-ray machine on the system, see what it really was. And we found that there was a PC in this lab right over here that was sending out a packet, one little measly Ethernet packet that was addressed to 137.190.1.0. Okay. Our switch router, layer 3 switch, treated that as a broadcast packet, would grab that packet, would send it to all of its interfaces. Those interfaces would grab it, send it to all the interfaces. We very quickly have a broadcast storm. It'd be racing around, chasing its tail, and everything would die. We found that this system, the computer here had some student had put an application on it called Buddy Fight that allowed somebody to hook up a microphone, earphones, and then talk to somebody at some other IP address. Which, that's cool. That was good. But for some reason, this person had typed in this 1.0 address, and so that PC would go out and look for that, and our network would die. The worst day was a day came to work and things were kind of quiet until for 20, 30 minutes or so, and then everything kind of fell apart in a very weird way. Things weren't down completely, but all across campus, connections became erratic. In inexplicable ways. Things weren't stop. They were just very slow, and we'd have situations, and a lot of times connections would go for a while, then they'd drop, then they'd come back. People would be not working, their neighbors would be working fine. We were getting weird messages on our servers. It was entirely perplexing. I went in to talk to Brooke Chase, who managed our switching equipment, to talk to him, to ask him what he might thought it'd be. And I swear to you, I looked at Brooke, and he was the color of this countertop. I've never seen anybody look like that. And I said, well, Brooke, we'll get through this. And he said, well, yeah, but I don't feel so good. And as I talked to him, it became obvious that he was in quite a bit of pain. We got one of his friends to cart him off to the hospital, and we stayed working on this problem. Ned didn't make headway on it all day long. And along about 5:15 that afternoon, and I was looking forward to a very frustrating all-nighter. Was really down in the mouth. Bless his heart, Brooke called me because and explained that he'd had had a kidney stone, and that was so he'd gone to the hospital, and they'd kind of gotten that alleviated a little bit, enough so that he could talk. He was concerned about what was going on. We asked some questions, and I said, well, this started about 9:20. And he said, well, ESNR was doing some work up in Allied Health at that time. Well, better than nothing, So I mentioned that to Bill Clark. He went over and unplugged Allied Health from the network. Instantly. All of our indicators, 100% good. All of our connections solid. Our error messages go away. Plug it back in. Things fall apart. Unplug it. We're good. Turned out, a technician up there installing an Ethernet line had swapped the transmit and receive pairs on one little RJ45 plug. Okay. Commit. Okay. Created a loopback situation so that broadcast packets went up to Allied Health, hit the loop, went back, racing around campus, overloaded the network, but didn't, made it really sick, but didn't kill it. We had, that wasn't supposed to happen. Our spanning tree protocol was supposed to prevent that. Didn't. I never really figured out why. But that was my worst day. And, I don't know if we'd ever got it if really Brooke had the call. And instead of a long night, by 5:15, our network was just fine, healthy, everything was good, as long as your office wasn't in the Allied Health building. And I was on my way home. Obviously, though, those kind of things couldn't be, that wasn't good. We had to be stronger. We had to be more robust than that. We had some problems, but we were able to approach a reasoned and careful planning, well planned out implementation of a new campus backbone architecture, which then the second summer of my department's existence, we deployed that. This was a very solid backbone implementation, a mesh backbone with a small number of nodes on the campus here that were interconnected with high-speed connections. Then the buildings would uplink to those connections. Started with 3 nodes, we later expanded to 4. And this was really Bill Clark's idea. his architecture. And it is the architecture that we still stay with and run with today and for the future. What we have since then are elaborations from that as it's faster, it's better, but as the technology and resources have allowed us to build on that. The conundrum that we faced at that time was the nature of these high-speed connections. At this time, a technology called ATM was kind of in vogue for high-speed connections, but a gigabit Ethernet technology was rising. And so as we went through the selection process, that was one of the calls that we had to make. And I don't know if it was partly dumb luck and partly timing. I'd like to hope partly it was vision on our part that we saw that gigabit Ethernet was solid. It was the future. That it was the technology that was going to last. And so that's what we went with. And again, that's where we are still today. Faster, better gigabit Ethernet, but it's still Ethernet. 3, 4, 5 months after that, after we did this, I was notified that there was a meeting, and a meeting of one of our statewide higher ed groups. And that at this meeting, the University of Utah was going to present their new and approved network plan. And I was given to understand that it would be a good thing for me to go down there with the not so subtle implication that it would be good for us rubes to find out what the people in the big city did. So I went down there, sat down, and the guy got up and he says, "Well, we have a plan. Our plan is we're going to create a meshed backbone network based on Ethernet." Okay, guys, let me know how it works out. Thank you. I left out. I need to roll back. I'm sorry, I got excited. I left out one of my slides. Left out. Let's rewind this to, and I don't have very many slides. Let me tell you, this is a third of my show right here. Let me roll back to, when we rolled out the Pegasus Mail. And really my measure for the success of Pegasus Mail, because in this business people don't call you up and say, "Hey, this is really great." Okay? What happens is that they get inspired, they get ideas, they get excited, and they call you up and say, "Why can't I do this? How do I do this? When are we going to be able to do this?" Okay? So that's McGrath's law number 1. That's what I learned at that point. Our new backbone network worked pretty well, but in a couple of years, because of the increase in traffic, and especially because of the advent of these worms that came out that would flood the network with probes and broadcasts, the Notchia and the Blaster worm, we would suffer these outages, because our after 3 or 4 years, the routers that we'd originally installed were having trouble keeping up, and then when these worms would hit, we'd just get flooded. I mean, things wouldn't die, but there would be for a period of time things would go flaky, connections would be lost, people would have to restart processes. I was very concerned about it. I hated it. We were able to, after the 2002 Olympics, get some of their equipment, throw some added money into blades that went into the chassis that we got, and started to roll out some good Cisco routers. And I saw that as we did that, that part of the network became stable, even when others were going down with these attacks. Towards the end of the, and I noticed, it's very true, there was, a fair degree of griping, and it was justified through the 2003-2004 school year about network outages. The network is bad, it was 5 times better than it had been 3 years ago, but, this is true, okay? And in fact, all of our outages that year were security events. People blamed the network, but it wasn't the network. It was people not taking care of their computers, allowing them to get infected. But we could overcome that with these new robust routers. Towards the end of the year 2004, we had been trying to schedule getting these new routers into place. Towards the end of the summer of the year 2004, we came to a crunch time. It's very involved to replace a router. It's very involved to, replace any network equipment, especially something as fundamental as a backbone router. We got to a point where we weren't really totally ready, but you're never really totally ready for anything, maybe. And so I had to weigh, do we not go forward with this? Or, do I crash ahead, have this done, and, work out the consequences? And I had in my mind, these outages that just continue, 2-3 times a week, really aggravating to me and to the users. And I thought they'd be alleviated with this new router, and so we'd have some bumps. Also, at this time, we had a project to set up redundancy in our internet connection. That would be where we had another internet connection working with UDM through our alumni house, and we set up a system where, we would be able to fail over from one route to the other. And frankly, I proceeded on this against the advice of Bill Clark, my engineer, who was dubious about our ability to pull this off. So we went ahead, and we got the new router in place, and it worked well for a period of a couple days. There were some rough edges. And then, for reasons I'm not quite sure, we got into a circumstance that we call route flapping. Okay? This, we have alternatives for how we get to the internet. Well, somehow between us and the internet provider, UEN, these systems that are supposed to automatically fail over, they start, doing this. They go one way, then the other. Packets that go out another way, they try to come back and fail there, and so very hard to debug, very hard to fix, very ugly situation for a matter of 2 or 3 days. Our Bill, we got some vendors engineers in, UEN engineers came in, couldn't beat it down, and this was a bad time of the year for this to happen, to lose our internet connection. And finally, the situation was resolved by rolling back to a very simple stub network, one connection into our campus, one static route in, and then we were good. So, that was my decision. Campus was in a bad state for a couple of days. It's true, and I got a lot of support, frankly, from the campus at that time. but I felt very bad about that. I don't know, though, I still don't know if it's a bad decision, because we did get the new router in place for that part of the campus, which was the library, that part of the campus. In fact, these blaster outages went away. So, the campus paid for a couple days for months of stability. Bad decision or not, I don't know. In debugging, or in a kind of a post-mortem on that thing, I was talking to a UEN engineer, and he said something. And I can't claim this as McGrath's law. I think it's another important truism, a little bit more technical than this. Another truism, which I had on my wall for quite a while. I can't claim this as McGrath's law, however. So this is Krukenberg's law. For those of you who might know Pete Krukenberg. He said, redundancy done poorly is worse than no redundancy at all. To do it right, to do redundancy right, you need the right people, the right organization, the right skill sets, the right communication, and the right plan. And this gives rise to the corollary, McGrath's corollary to Krukenberg's law, however. It's the people, stupid. You wonder why things work, you wonder why they don't work. Don't look to the equipment, don't look to the technology. It's the people. And it's kind of interesting. As I planned this, this was where I stopped. As again, I say this is the fall of 2004, and so it's somehow out of my mind. Nothing real significant has happened since then. Patterns have been laid, and everything else is mere elaboration. Many important people have come to Weber State since then. I've made very good friends since then. I think I've been privileged to be part of the development of a very strong department that does a much better job of managing the infrastructure that we built in these years. And I really don't believe that, I think that it's just a coincidence that one of the early symptoms of Alzheimer's is loss of short-term memory. Quickly, I'd like to run over as what I saw as some of the themes of this, the themes of this journey. One is the shift in the place of information technology. Information technology has gone from being a location of innovation to fundamentally a utility, something that very, very truly the campus can't do without, but where consistency, availability is much more important to the campus than anything else. Some of the consequences of this have been the commoditization of computing. Computing is very generic. Eric told me once that when the campus made the decision to go with faxes, that it was a high-level decision. Visits to the president from vendors, much discussion across campus. Okay. Our selections of the sons was made between 2 or 3 of us right here, 3 or 4. Campus doesn't care, just as long as it works. Another consequence has been the evolution or de-evolution of academic computing. As I say, started in academic computing, but as computing has become a commodity, it has become generic. The need for a specific academic computing effort has kind of faded, or at least blended into information technology in general. Another theme, of course, as I've alluded to, has been the power going to the desktops. Desktops have evolved from early when I came, these machines that were barely able to do anything. And now they are arguably these bloated beasts that have resources much more in excess than anything that would be reasonably needed by most users, most offices. And again, this has given rise to this tension between our desktops business tools, or are they part of, an extension of personality of the users? I'm thinking of, we have a kind of a cult of personality in the personal computer. And I think the expenses of this have just been untold to the institution. Now every college, most departments have their own team, computer support people, often professionals doing full time. It would take a considerable amount of effort to even get a good estimate of what the university spends on desktop support. And so I think back, well, how did this happen? This is, kind of crazy. How did this happen? Who did this to us, And I think about, my role, connecting these things, and building these things, and agitating, and saying, look here, this is computing. And so today, I will tell you, I have sinned. It is humbling. I have sinned, and I repent. Again, we have the network as the totality of user experience. And another one of the themes is how do we manage that? We have there the tension between the consistency in the user's experience versus the kind of customizability or something that really speaks to the user. Again, in my time, I have seen that, when I came, it was very central. Real computing was what you got from the VAX. This revolution, which I have seen, which maybe I had a part in lighting the fire for, that then this explosion, these out-of-control desktops, this revolution, which I feel like it is, as revolutions do, it has eaten its children, in my case. So we went clear to the other pendulum. Now I see us swinging back, okay? Because there are real problems, for manage an institutional environment with no control. I see through the evolution, through the use of browsers pointed at portals, users can have a very rich experience, but still there is a cohesiveness and a consistency and a manageability for the sins of my youth. Other things I see in the future are problems for the information technology division, specifically looking outward. I see as a typical thing we need to do is manage expectations. Okay. We have to have some way of working out with the community realistic expectations in terms of the breadth and the quality of services versus the resources that we are allowed to use. Looking inward, again, I see we must organize. We must learn to organize ourselves as a utility. The exciting pirate days that I've talked about here are gone. They're behind us. Okay. I believe that most of the services that we provide are now probably at something around a 99.9% availability. That means 11 unscheduled outages. Unanticipated outages average around 11 minutes a week. 11 minutes a week. 99.9. That is not good enough. That is not good enough. The institution deserves better. The institution has to have better. We have to be at 99.99. Okay? That's an average 7 seconds unscheduled downtime a week. That's what we need to be working for. So how do you get there? How do you get there? A lot of fancy hardware, a lot of great new systems. Have you learned anything today? Okay. It's proceduralization. It's change control. It's careful implementation of the best practices from as documented in the ITIL Information Technology Infrastructure Library. And I really believe that it's very important for you all to follow that path. But it ain't me. So if I could quote from Mark Twain, and I believe this is Tom Sawyer. So there ain't nothing more to talk about, and I am rotten glad of it. Because if I'd have known what a trouble it was to make a speech, I wouldn't have tackled it, and I ain't a-going to no more. But I reckon I got to light out for the territory. Aunt Sally, she's going to adopt me and civilize me. And I can't stand it. I've been there before.